Okay, hi everybody. Okay, so we are recording now, and I hope everybody who was away had a good trip and welcome back. We so the first thing I guess I just want to give you all a bracha because I was a sandik this morning, and some people have asked me to give them a bracha. So Hashem should bless you all with good health, parnasa, nachas, everything that you would ask for from Hashem. Hashem should grant it to you. Okay, all right. So we're on page 478 in the Kuzari, and we're in the middle of a part where Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is essentially, after he's gotten through explaining so many of these complex ideas of cosmogony about how God created the universe using the Sefer Yetzirah, this mystical tome about how the letters of the alphabet are the building blocks for all of reality, the king asked him a basic question, like, what do I need this for? Why isn't it enough to just have simple faith that God created the world in 6 days and rested on the seventh, as is recorded in the Torah? And so Rabbi Yehuda Halevi's response is somewhat shocking. And the response that he gives is, you know what? You're right. You don't need to know anymore. Why then is this why is Sefer Yetzirah even necessary? It was written by Avraham Avinu, according to our tradition. So why did Avraham even bother writing it? And he says Avraham wrote it because he was at a lower level of development spiritually at a certain stage in his life. And he felt he needed to demonstrate certain concepts to himself about existence and about how God interacts with reality. And that's the reason why he wrote this book. But a person of a higher level of faith really should not need any of this material. And that's really the way he understands the Talmud's statement to the way that the Talmud records God's statement of Avraham. God said to him, Vayotze oto hachutza, that God took Avraham outside, and he said, Habetna hashamayma, go look up heavenward, usfor hakochavim im tuchal lispor otam. See if you can count the stars. The Gemara, in explaining what God was really saying to Avraham, not just telling him that your progeny will be like the stars of the sky, but was also telling him that that I'm elevating you above the stars. Vayotze oto hachutza. God takes him outside of the star system, and not just outside, outdoors, but outside the star system. And God tells him, Tzei me'itztagninut shelcha. Leave your astrology, leave your astronomy. None of this study is relevant to you. It's not pertinent to you. Now, this is really quite curious for a couple of reasons. As we started talking about this last week, and we mentioned that it's curious because other great Jewish thinkers that are contemporaries or come before or after the Rambam feel that, come after Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, feel that just to the contrary, it is important for a person to utilize his or her intellect to better understand God's interaction with our universe. And as a matter of fact, according to the Rambam, if you don't utilize your intellect, you're actually not on a very high level of connection with Hashem, because you simply cannot grasp God properly with your intellect without a working knowledge of how God interacts with reality. And the only way that you can know that is if you study nature, you study science, and you study cosmology and astronomy and all of these other disciplines. You simply can't understand God. And without a proper understanding of God, you simply cannot have dveikut, have this deep connection with God. The Rambam says this most explicitly towards the end of the guide. And maybe for next week, maybe I'll show you where the Rambam actually says this explicitly. But the Rambam does say that you're still on quite a low level. You may have gained a lot of Torah knowledge, but you're still not at the level that even comes close to being able to prophesy because you simply lack that knowledge of God. But Rabbi Yehuda Halevi feels that such knowledge is not necessary. Another reason why it's quite curious for Rabbi Yehuda Halevi to say that is that we have many of our great sages who were known as great masters of science and nature. And as a matter of fact, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi himself is going to point out to us that in the remainder of the fourth essay, many passages from the Talmud where our sages themselves are extolled for their great knowledge of science, nature, astronomy, and so forth. The great sage Shmuel said about himself that the pathways of the stars are as clear to me, or are as well known to me, as the streets of my hometown Nahar Da'ah. Basically, what he was saying is that I'm a master astronomer. I understand the trajectory of all of the stars. And for him, it was something that was perhaps considered to be something to be proud of, that he understood astronomy properly. Now, one at face value could respond, a certain segment of the rabbinic community needs to know about the stars in order to be able to calculate the Jewish calendar. Because if you cannot intercolate the solar calendar with the lunar calendar, then you won't know when Rosh Chodesh is. You won't know when the holidays are. You always have to make sure that Pesach falls out in the spring and not too early in the season where it's not yet spring. And in order to do that, you have to know when to insert an extra Adar every few years. You have to be able to study the astronomical bodies to know when the seasons are changing, when the summer solstice is, when the equinoxes fall out both in the spring and in the fall, and the winter solstice. You need to know those things, and the only way to know them is through a study of astronomy. So it seems that Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is saying that particularly vis-a-vis your desire to become close to Hashem, the things that are contained in Sefer Yetzirah and in philosophy, which is a different discipline, but has the same project of trying to explain the origins of the universe, these things are simply not important. Now, this brings us to page 478, subparagraph 2, where the rabbi continues, and he says, even Plato spoke of the prophet who lived during the reign of King Marinus, who spoke with prophetic vision to the philosopher who was engaged in philosophical methods. He said, you will not reach me with these methods, but rather only via the teachings of those whom I have placed as messengers between myself and my creations. By this, he was referring to the prophets and the true meanings of the Torah. Now, we've talked a little bit about this in past discussions over the years, but we haven't really seen this discussion, at least not in going through the text, about this story of Plato, who was a philosopher who lives in the 3rd century before the Common Era, and who lives during a prophet who lives during the reign of King Marinus or Marinus. And we have no idea what this story is, but we did see previously that there was a story back at the beginning of essay number 4, where Rabbi Yehuda had made mention of an encounter between a philosopher and a prophet. I don't expect everyone to remember this, but we did back in section 4, in essay 4, paragraph 3, we talked about this encounter between Plato and Jeremiah. So here we have a bit more of an expansion upon this, but apparently there's some story, and it seems mostly to have been lost to the mists of time. But Rabbi Yehuda Halevi talks about a king Marinus. So I'm just showing you the footnote, just to refer to the footnote. According to Shlomo Pines, in an article from Jerusalem Studies in Arabic and Islam, Volume 2 from 1980, the account of King Marinus is from the Book of Laws, a work by the Arabic pseudo-Platonist K. al-Nawamis. In it, the author relates that there lived a Greek king Marinus who is mentioned by Homer. Marinus met with bad fortune and consulted with his philosophers. The philosophers in turn advised him to consult with the leading prophet of the time. Marinus thus dispensed the delegation led by his leading philosopher, Plato, to the prophet. In the course of the recorded conversation between the philosopher and the prophet rebuked the philosopher with the words quoted in the above text. So this is the words of the prophet to the philosopher, basically telling him, you will not reach me, meaning God. You will not reach God with these methods, with these philosophic methods, but rather only via the teachings of those whom I have placed as messengers between myself and my creations, meaning my prophets. By this, he was referring to the prophets and the true teachings of the Torah. I continue in the footnote, in the course of the recorded conversation between the philosopher and the prophet rebuked the philosopher with the words quoted in the above text. And then, unfortunately, I write in parentheses, there is no King Marinus to be found in Homer's works, because Marinus is a Latin name, and Homer lives during the times of the Greeks, long before the Romans. So the source for Al-Nawamis' story is somewhat speculative. Pines offers a cogent theory in his article. Again, there are many, many legends and myths that are circulating in the times of the Yehuda Halevi. I did mention to you when we learned at the beginning of the fourth essay that the Abarbanel, in his commentary to Sefer Yirmiyah, also is familiar with a story of the encounter between Jeremiah and Plato. Now, the dating of that story is a little bit hard to do. You can finesse it if you play with the dates a little bit, depending upon which scholars you follow, as when the Churban Beit HaMikdash was, Churban Beit HaMikdash, the first temple's destruction was, and when Plato lived. You can get them to their lives to overlap, but Jeremiah must have been or Plato must have been very, very young in order for that encounter to have taken place in Egypt, which is according to the story where it took place. And I'll just share with you, just because I'm a bit of a nerd, I'll just share with you what this is the text from Shlomo Pines on the pseudo-Platonic question in the Kuzari 4 and the K.L. Nawamis story. So I already quoted for you the story, and we'll just read a paragraph from what Pine says. He says, it is, I think, unbelievable that a Greek author could have imagined that the name Marinos, which is of Latin origin, but was not uncommon in late antiquity in the eastern part of the Roman Empire, has been mentioned by Homer. On the other hand, it is very improbable that an Arabic or Syriac author should have added, on his own initiative and without any factual basis, the reference to Homer. The supposition that Marinos may have been substituted for another name may provide a way out of this quandary. A possible hypothesis might be that the original name was Minos, who is referred to by Homer. In the Arabic script, the substitution would require a major alteration, the insertion of an aleph and a ra. Those are two Arabic letters. We may, however, imagine that the name Minos was misread in the Syriac script, in which its replacement by Marinos might only require a relatively slight change, namely the insertion of a resh. A Syriac scribe or an Arabic translator might, who, when confronted with the unfamiliar name Minos, have replaced it by the relatively common Marinos. In the Platonic, or as most scholars believe, pseudo-Platonic dialogue, Minos reference is made to the contradictory, both positive and negative views on King Minos. Was this a good guy or a bad guy? The author of the dialogue takes a positive view. And basically, as the story goes, he basically takes the side of the prophet who speaks to his philosopher. And when he meets the prophet, he realizes that the philosopher can only take him so far. Anyway, we don't have to take a look at this any further. The whole purpose of this whole narrative that's provided by Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is for the sake of illustration, to let us know that when you pit a philosopher against a prophet, the philosopher will quickly see that all of the profound wisdom that he professes to have pales in comparison to the presentation of prophetic knowledge that is put forth by the prophet. And why is this important? It's important because, as Rabbi Yehuda Levi has said multiple times already, philosophers sound sophisticated and they present us with a lot of very interesting information, but that information does not enhance our connection with Hashem. Just because you know more stuff does not mean that you have fulfilled your objective that God has laid out for mankind, which is to cleave unto God to the best degree possible. And remember, we've spoken about this a number of times. This is antithetical to the belief of the Rambam. The Rambam is of the belief that knowledge equals conjunction with the divine, because the Rambam understands that God is pure intellect, that the thing that makes us have the divine spark or to be created in God's image is our intellect, is our mind. So if our mind is a semblance of God, then God must be a supercharged, infinitely supercharged mind. That's essentially what God is. And man's challenge is to hone and perfect his mind to the point where he connects with that supercharged mind that is God. Okay? So that's the Rambam's view. But Rabbi Yehuda Halevi takes a decidedly very contrary view to that. And he says that your intellect, no matter how perfected it is not the key to connection with the Ribono Shel Olam, because God is far more than just pure intellect, which is the way the philosophers, Aristotle, profess that. God is the ineffable being that is the cause of all. And you cannot confine God to just being a species of intellect that is infinite. God is so much more than that. And therefore, if we wish to have a connection with him, we need to accept the knowledge of the Torah and the mitzvot that God tells us to do. And when we follow the divine prescription, that's the key to devekut, that's the key to connection. Yes?
If I were going to put one thing that I would say would characterize Hashem, it would be bestowing good. I mean, we learned that Hashem created the world because he wanted to bestow good on us. So I would think that if you want to emulate God in his, most obvious form, you would want to do good and do chesed.
Yes, I would agree. And that seems to be the more obvious way that Hashem is characterized in Tanakh, right? The Yud Gimel Midos of Rachamim is what God teaches to Moshe, that Hashem says, this is what I want you to know about me. And it's interesting, the Rambam has to contend with that challenge. I recently just finished teaching Moreh Nevuchim online, and that was one of the last issues that the Rambam contended with at the very end of the Guide for the Perplexed, the Moreh Nevuchim. And he says that, God by his nature, because he's an infinitely perfect being, and he gives an analogy to wealth. He says, when a person is wealthy, there are two levels of wealth. There's a person who's wealthy, who can afford to take care of himself, his wife, his children, even his grandchildren, and maybe even his great-grandchildren. That's a wealthy person. But that's not the ultimate wealth. The ultimate wealth is where a person is so wealthy that he shares his wealth with even people outside of his own family. And he helps to prop up and make the world a better place. He says, if you want to compare God, who is the ultimate being, to wealth, just by analogy, God by his very nature must overflow of himself and be benevolent, because that's what infinitely wealthy beings, infinitely rich beings do by their very nature. That's the way the world came into existence, according to the Rambam, just because God naturally overflows and bestows goodness. But for the Rambam, that's not the ultimate way to emulate Hashem. It is a byproduct of trying to attain a dveikus with Hashem. But the key to dveikus, to attachment to God, is through one's intellect. And once you achieve that, your goal should be to become more and more godlike, to the point where you overflow of your benevolence to others, just like Hashem does of his essence.
A lot of people don't have the intellect necessary to do that.
Yes.
I can see that every human being who's alive has the capability to do chesed in some way.
You're so right. You are so right. And this is the great criticism of the Rambam's philosophy, is that it's elitist, meaning that it's only accessible for a very small percentage of the Jewish people. Most people will never be able to achieve what the Rambam extols. But the Rambam lives with that. He says, I'm okay. He doesn't say it outright. He says, but he's okay with that. Just like, only a very small percentage of Jews have achieved prophecy. A very small percentage of Jews have achieved ultimate closeness with the Ribono Shel Olam. And for most of the Jewish population, we content ourselves with where we are in our lower levels of attachment. But anyone who's interested in reaching higher levels, the Rambam will not hide the truth from us. He will say, this is how you do it. If you're on a lower level, you don't have a great intellect. Okay, so you'll have to settle for something less than great. Not everyone can be great. And as much as we try to, in our postmodern society today, try to find a way of saying that everyone is special. No, not everyone is special. Not everyone is great. Some people are merely mediocre. We're beinanim, and we're never going to achieve that ultimate level. Now, what about the fact that everyone can do chesed? The Rambam is of the opinion, and he actually says this explicitly. He says that people who devote their entire lives to giving to other people and to doing acts of chesed are actually squandering their humanity, if you can believe it. I don't mean to portray the Rambam in a negative light, but he says, if the ultimate goal of humanity is the perfection of the intellect, sometimes you can only do that if you isolate yourself from other people. You have to spend time perfecting yourself. And then in your spare time, do chesed, okay? But your priority, if you wish to attain perfection in this life, is to really focus first on on perfecting your intellect. And then once you reach a certain level, through the overflow that you wish to do to emulate God, you'll do acts of chesed as a byproduct of that. But if before perfecting your intellect, you instead say, I'm leaving the base medrash, or I'm leaving my studies, I'm leaving my speculation, I'm leaving my understanding of reality in order to feed the homeless and to shoe the shoeless and to take care of society, to take care of my brother and sister. Okay, you did a good thing, but you've squandered the opportunity to perfect yourself as a human being and be ultimately close with Hashem. Now, that's not a very appealing theology, right? It's not a very appealing theology, which is why, in many respects, this component of the Rambam's teachings are sort of, they don't let the Moreh Nevuchim in the base medrash. It's not usually one of the key svarim in the base medrash. Rabbi Yehuda Halevi's theology is much more appealing because, number one, it allows an entree to dveikus to Hashem for every single human being. Not only every Jew, but every single human being has an entree through emulation of God and through acts of goodness and piety to be close to Hashem, without having to go through years and years of study and analysis and very difficult intellectual exercises. But which one is it? Which one is it? a mind is a terrible thing to waste. You ever hear that slogan before? So that's the Rambam's position. But Rabbi Yehuda Levi's position is the mind is not where it's at. All you need from a mindful standpoint are the teachings of the Torah. Put them into practice through doing the mitzvot, observing halacha, and that is what will bring you ultimate closeness to Hashem. Okay, now we will hold it here. I guess the only other thing I wanted to mention, I mentioned a long time ago. Well, you know what? I'll save that for another time. Let us go on. We'll hold it here in the Kuzari. And let's go on to the Parsha. Okay, here we go. This Shabbos, we're going to be finishing Sefer Bereshit, the book of Genesis, which is in itself just such a delightful study, especially these last few parshiot, Vayeshev, Miketz, Vayigash, Vayechi. We look at, this is already after Yaakov Avinu has passed away, and now we look at the passing of Yosef. And when Yosef passes away, the Torah records that Yosef did two things. Vayomer Yosef el Echav Anochi Meit. Yosef tells his brothers, I'm shortly going to die. Velokim pakod yifkod etchem. But nonetheless, even though I'm going to be gone, Hashem will eventually visit upon you, or to be poked someone is to come to them at an allotted time and grant something to them. We know that, like for example, it says Vashem pakadet Sarah, that God visited Sarah. What does it mean he visited her? Meaning that he granted her that which he had promised her, which was pregnancy. And so to be poked someone is to say, okay, I'm going to come and I'm going to give you that which you deserve at the allotted time when it needs to happen. So that's what Yosef is basically telling his brothers. Hashem is going to be poked you, ve'ela etchem min haaretz hazot, and at that allotted time, he is going to lift you out of this land, out of Egypt, el haaretz asher nishba le'Avraham liYitzchak u'liYaakov, to the land that he has sworn to Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. Okay? And then Yosef does a second thing. Vayashba Yosef et bnei Yisrael lemor. Yosef placed an oath on the children of Israel. Now, what is the difference between Yosef's brothers and the children of Israel? Are not Yosef's brothers the children of Israel? Yisrael meaning his father Yaakov. So it's a very curious change of terminology. But he places an oath upon these people. Some commentaries say that the previous pasuk was referring to specifically Yosef's 11 brothers, and this pasuk of imposing an oath is in reference to all 70 of the people that were Jewish at this time, or by now there were more than 70 because this is many years afterwards. So there must be hundreds of Jews living in Egypt now, and he places an oath on all of Bnei Israel, saying, "Pakod yifkod Elokim etchem," that God will surely visit you, meaning he will come to you at the allotted time. V'ha'alitem et atzmotai mizeh. And when that happens, I want you to lift up my bones from this place, meaning take my remains and carry them with you through the desert and bring me for burial in Eretz Yisrael. According to Talmudic tradition, this is not only true that this is what they did for Yosef, but they did the same for each one of Yaakov's sons. Each one of Yaakov's sons were transported from Egypt, where they were buried, and they were reinterred in Eretz Yisrael after 40 years of traveling through the desert. But the simple understanding of the text that this was only Yosef, and as a matter of fact, when the Torah concludes the book of Bereshis by saying Vayisem ba'aron b'Mitzrayim, that Yosef was placed in a special casket in Egypt, And according to one of the Targums, his casket was buried in the Nile. It was dropped into the Nile because it was an iron casket, dropped to the bottom of the Nile, so that it would bless the Nile, because the Egyptians viewed Yosef as a source of bracha, and B, they wanted there to be a reminder of where Yosef was buried, so that when it would be time to leave Egypt, they would know where to find Yosef's casket. Okay? Okay, so we'll put that idea aside for just a minute. What is very curious is that we have this double language of pakod evkod, or pakod yifkod, God will surely visit. It's not just like Vashem pakad et sarah, that Hashem in the binyan kal, in the simple conjugation of the word poked, that Hashem visited Sarah. Notice that Yosef uses this double language twice. First, when speaking to his brothers, pakod Elokim pakod yivkod etchem, that God will be poked yivkod, a double language. And again, in the second pasuk, when he imposes this oath, he says, pakod yivkod Elokim etchem, that God will visit his redemption upon you. Now, why is that part of the oath? He's already told everybody that God will allot a time when it's time for your redemption. If his concern was that he wanted to make sure that his remains would be disinterred and transferred to Eretz Yisrael, why does he have to say this a second time, that God will visit redemption upon you? And then at that time, I want you to take my remains with you. Why does he have to say that a second time? And why the double language of pakod yifkod? When we have this principle that God told Moshe, we're going to see this in next week's Parsha. God has this encounter with Moshe at the burning bush. And the instruction that Hashem gives to Moshe is to tell the Jewish people that you are the guy that was sent by Hashem to redeem them. And how are they going to know that it's you? So as the Medrash explains, you're going to use the same language that Yosef used to describe how the redemption would take place. So therefore, we have this pasuk in Parsha Shmos, Lech ve'asafta et zignei Yisrael. Hashem tells Moshe, go and gather the elders of Israel, who presumably will have a repository of tradition dating back generations. They will know that when you speak with them, they will be looking for a specific language to give them. The amarta alehem, and you shall say to them, Hashem, Yud Kei Vav Kei, also part of our tradition. Elokei avotechem, the God of your fathers, Nirah Elai, appeared before me. Elokei Avraham, Yitzchak, v'Yakov lemor. The God of Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov told me to tell you, Pakod pakadati etchem. I have come now to visit my redemption upon you, ve'et he'asui lachem b'Mitzrayim, and to also take care of all that was done to you in Egypt. Now again, the double language, pakod pakadati, and the Medrash explains that that Moshe specifically used this language in order to show that he was the real deal, in order to show that he was genuine. We also find this language in Parshat Bishalach. I should have copied that also in this handout that you have on the screen, is that when the Jews left Egypt, it says, Vayikach Moshe et atzmot Yosef imo, that Moshe took the remains of Yosef with him, ki hashbeya hishpia et bnei Yisrael lemor, because Yosef had imposed an oath on bnei Yisrael, saying, Pakod yifkod Elokim etchem, v'halitem et atzmosai mizeh itechem. Exactly the same language that appears in our parsha, that God will visit the redemption upon you, and at that time, I want you to take my remains with you. Yeah.
It's possible that pakod yifkod is also to remember. I don't know why I have it in my head. Pakod means also to remember.
To remember, yes, it does. Pakod, right. Pakod pakadati etchem ve'ese asui lachem b'Mitzrayim. That's what God is saying. I remember you. But it's more than just a remembrance, because to remember someone is to say, I remember you, but I don't necessarily have to take action. But to be poked someone is to remember your obligation to them and to take action as a result. So it's a much more involved verb. So I want to share with you a very beautiful commentary from the Al-Sheikh HaKadosh, who lives in the 16th century. He's part of that mystical community of Rav Yosef Karo and the Arizal. And he had his own Beit HaKnesset, and he used to give the drasha every Shabbos. The legend is that he used to learn Torah with a malach, with an angel, and that is how he composed his commentary called Torat Moshe on Chumash. So it's a very short snippet from a very long commentary, but he writes as follows: Hine katavnu, ki Yosef haya merkava el hashchina b'Mitzrayim. We have written in many places that Yosef is the chariot of God in Egypt. I touched on this last week when we talked about Yosef's chariot. But the idea of being God's chariot is that Yosef is the basis for God to be in Egypt. When Yosef is around, his holiness gives a repository for God's divine presence to rest in Egypt and act as a protective cover for the rest of the Jewish people. Va'alkein bihistalek Yosef, halo yid'aku ki echa ya'asu. So when Yosef was about to die, there was certainly reason for the rest of Bnei Yisrael to be concerned. Will God depart from us as well, now that Yosef is gone? Alkein Amar Anochi meit, Klomar Anochi hun hane'edar me'itechem. What he meant to say was, I'm going to die, with the emphasis on the word I. Only I am going to die, but fear not, because Hashem will still be with you. Ach ve'elokim hu beidino pakod yifkod, ki lo yanun v'lo yishan shomer Yisrael. Because God is not going anywhere. God does not sleep or slumber. Even though it's true that I am responsible for God's Shekhinah being here, he and his entourage are here in Egypt because I brought him here. Nonetheless, when I die, Hashem will remain with you. That's what Yosef was reassuring the rest of Bnei Israel. V'lavo el ha'inyan. So let's get to the point, he says. Nashit lev el ma'amaram zal. Let's pay attention to the Midrash in Pirkei de Rebbe Eliezer, which ki mesoret hayta biyadam Yaakov, that the Jews had a tradition that dated back to Yaakov Avinu. Ki ha'omer pikida kefula hu hagoel ha'amiti. Whoever uses a double language of pakod pakadati or pakod yifkod is the Redeemer. He's got to use a double language of the Hebrew verb poked, okay? And that's why God specifically told Moshe to use the double language of pakod. V'zehu pakod yifkod. V'hu ma'amar Moshe liYisrael. And that's why Moshe said to the Jewish people, Ko amar Hashem, pakod pakadati etchem. And that's exactly the language that Moshe employed. V'tzorech tuv ta'am el hayot kefal ha'pikida, siman el amitat hagoel. But we need an explanation. Why is a double language of pakod the symbol or the sort of the delineation of the Egyptian redemption? Ach hu, and I'll explain to you why. Ki mashkon gadol haya lahem liYisrael ligael. Because the Jewish people in Egypt had a huge amount of collateral with them when they were living in Egypt. What does he mean by that? The Jewish people were not just themselves in Egypt, but they had something with them that was extremely valuable. V'hu ki shchina v'chol pamalya shel ma'ala hayu begalut. Because when the Jewish people were in exile, Hashem and his entourage, whatever that means, meaning his Shekhinah, his divine presence, were also in Galus. When the Jewish people are in exile, God is in exile with us. We know this from a number of different sources. The Alshich is not innovating this idea. For example, when the Torah says at the end of, in Parshat Nitzavim, towards the end of the Torah, V'shav Hashem Elokecha et shavutecha, that God will return your captivities, your exiles, and return you back to Eretz Yisrael. Now, in English, return is both a simple verb and a what's the word? Not reflexive, but lashon hif'il. How do you say hif'il in English? Active? No, I think that's PL. Hif'il is to do something to somebody else, right? It's a causative verb. But in English, the word return could mean the same, could mean two totally different things. For example, I returned to my house after having been gone for 5 hours. But also it means I returned the package to the manufacturer. So you can either return yourself or you can return something else. It's the same word in English. In Hebrew, to return yourself is lashuv, to return yourself. Lahashiv is to return an object.
To have something returned.
To cause an object to return back to where it was originally, but not yourself. So the curiosity is when the Torah says, Vishav Hashem Elokecha et Shavutecha, that God will return your captives, it should have said, Veheshiv Hashem et Shavutecha, that God will cause your captives to return back to Eretz Yisrael, but it doesn't. It uses the simple conjugation of God himself will return. So our sages teach us that what that means is that whenever we are in Galus, whenever we're in exile, wherever we find ourselves, Hashem is there with us. And therefore, the Alshich's point is using that principle that the idea of a double pakod pakadati is v'hu bitachon umashkon, is there's a security that we carry with us whenever we're in Galus. We are guaranteed to eventually come out of Galus because Hashem wants to come out of Galus. In order for Hashem to come out of Galus, we have to come out of Galus. God would never forsake his divine presence and his angels watching over the Jewish people on a permanent basis to be in exile. As the Medrash points out, that the salvation of the Jewish people is synonymous with the salvation of God himself. And that's why what Yosef was essentially telling his brothers, don't be frightened, because even though I'm going to die shortly, God will never forsake you in your galut, in your diaspora. And therefore you are guaranteed that no matter what happens to me, God will surely cause there to be a time when you will be redeemed. Uvazeh, and with this idea, banu el inyan omro vayashba v'chule lemor. Now we can understand why Yosef imposes this oath in the way that he does. Ki omro, and remember, keep your mind focused on the double language of pakod yifkod, because we're going to get there in just a moment. Ki omro lemor bilti tzodek be'etzim. Really, the pasuk should have said vayashba Yosef et bnei Yisrael, that Yosef imposed an oath on bnei Yisrael, and he said, "V'halitem et atmotai mizeh," lift up my remains. What is the word lemor? Ahu ki masoret hapekida kifula. The idea is that when God visits upon us to redeem us, it's going to be a double redemption. Masra Yaakov li Yosef, Yosef lechav. And this is what Yaakov told Yosef and what Yosef gave to his brothers and was passed down from generation to generation. V'lihiyot shemasoret zeh muchrach legaloto, ki al bilti sim lev elav. He says, we have to, it was necessary to reveal this double language to all future generations, because this double language would guarantee that we would not try to leave at the wrong time. Because Bnei Ephraim yatzu imish Efrati v'naflu biyad plishtim shloshim shana mikodem. We witness the fact that according to the Midrash and according to Targum Yonatan, what happened 30 years before it was time to leave? A whole group of men from Shevet Ephraim took it upon themselves to depart early, and they were all destroyed by the Philistines. So we know this from the Midrash, that if you don't know when it's time to leave, you're going to have problems. So Yaakov gave this message to Yosef. Yosef gave it to his brothers, and he said, preserve this knowledge because it's going to prove to be necessary for everyone to know when it's time to be redeemed. Ve'eminu l'Moshe shahaya goel amiti al koflo hapekida ba'omro pakod pakadati kimefurish b'makoma. And that's why they believed Moshe when he used that double language. Al kein me'ata asa Yosef ikar lahashbiyim bichlal shvuat halachat atzmotav gam al zeh. But that's why Yosef conjoined both things. He was basically placing an oath on Bnei Israel to do two things. V'zeu omro vayashba Yosef et echav b'shnei dvarim. Echad lemor pakod yifkod. The first one is the word lemor is not going on the previous words, but it's vayashba Yosef et Bnei Israel. And what oath did Yosef impose on Bnei Israel? Lemor pakod yifkod, to always remember or to speak over to the next generation the double language of pakod yifkod. Ki hishbi'am lemor lizaram tevot elu kfulot. Because I want you to make sure that your future generations know this double language. And the second thing he said to them was, V'gam hishbi'am v'ha'alitem et atzmotai, that I want you to remove my remains and bring them with you to Eretz Yisrael. And that's why he used the double language. Why? Because there are two things that are coming out of Egypt. When you, Bnei Israel, leave Egypt, what else is coming with you? Hashem's Shechina. Okay, so in other words, here's the point that the Alshich wants to make. When you come out of Egypt, it's not just you that are coming out of Egypt, but Hashem's Shechina and all of his angels, the heavenly entourage that have been with you, they are coming with you out of Egypt. And that's the double language of Pakod Yifkod. And in addition to that, so there are two things that you need to remember. Remember the language of Pakod Yifkod. Why? Because number one, it's the code word for how to know who the Redeemer is. But beyond that, not only is it the code word, it is actually descriptive of what your redemption will be like. It is Moshe Rabbeinu describing to Bnei Israel that you have been in Egypt for 210 years together with your partner, the Shechina and the angels. And when Hashem decides that it's time for you to leave, it's not just you who are leaving, but Hashem's Shechina and the angels are leaving with you. That's the double language of Pakod Yifkod. Now, why is that an important piece of information? Because it gives so much empowerment to the Jewish people. It empowers the Jewish people to understand that not only are we not alone, but so great is the power of Bnei Israel that Hashem has been in Galus with us this entire time. And it is our responsibility to know when it's time to return to Eretz Yisrael, so that not only we can return to the land, but Hashem's Shechina can return to the land as well and find respite and find and return back to the place of holiness. Coupled with that is also Yosef's imposition of an oath, make sure you take me with you, because I was the way that the Shechina came down to Egypt in the first place. Since I was the means for the Shechina to come down into the Galus in the first place, it's only proper that when the Shechina is ready to leave, you take me with you and the Shechina. It would be unfair to leave me alone when the whole basis for your survival in Egypt was because I was able to bring the Shechina down to Egypt. So make sure that when you come out and you take the Shechina with you, that I accompany you and the Shechina. And that's why these two oaths tie together. It's not a singular oath, but rather it's two oaths. Always teach your children Pakod Yifkod, and also take me out. And the Pakod Yifkod double language is because it's not just you leaving Egypt, but it's also Hashem and His Shechina. So that in itself is encouraging enough. And to translate that message of Pakod Yifkod to the Jews of the diaspora today, imagine how much of Hashem's Shechina has already returned to Eretz Yisrael through the founding of the Medina. And imagine how much more work we have to do in order to make sure that we restore the remainder of the Shechina that is out here in Golus with us back to its rightful place. Now, I'm going to leave you with one final idea, just with the remaining moments that we have. This is articulated by the Imre Emes, but you can find it in other commentaries as well. Pakod Yifkod, and he quotes the Medrash that says that this was a tradition, that whoever's going to be the Redeemer is going to use a double language. And I just want to read to you one line from the Imre Emes. Piresh pakodhu shebitchila kodem lefikida befoal mitoreret guula belev vizehu pikida kfula. He says, let me explain to you the double language of Pakod Yifkod. Redemption happens in two stages. First, there is a stirring in the heart of the Jew in the exile that it's time for redemption. The second stage is the redemption itself. So again, the redemption occurs in two stages. First, there's a mental awareness that it's time to leave. It's time to leave Gullus. The second Yifkod is the actual departure. And Ita b'midrash, and that's why the Medrash says that Kol dodi dofek al yedei Moshe, dofek otiot pakod. This is an amazing Medrash because it says that, you know, in Shir Hashirim, it says the knocking on the door of my beloved is Hashem knocking on the door, telling us it's time to go home. Okay, my beloved is knocking at the door. The word dofek, which means to knock, is the same letters as pakod, pakod. So that the knocking on the door, you know, that famous essay from Rav Soloveitchik, The Five Knocks of the 20th Century. It's a worthwhile read. Someone remind me which book is it? Which book that was published from Rav Soloveitchik's writings has the five knocks of the?
In English, it's called Fate and Destiny.
Fate and Destiny, right? Thank you. Rav Soloveitchik doesn't quote this Medrash. I don't think he does, but he talks about this idea that there were five knocks for the Jewish people that happened with the founding of the state of Israel. But the knocking that the Imre Emes is talking about is in the heart and the mind and the soul of every single Jew. First, Hashem knocks on your head and says, what are you still doing here? It's time. And then the second redemption is when you actually fly there and you get an apartment and you're there and you're living the dream. That's the Pakod Yifkod. So some people haven't yet gotten to the first Pakod. Other people have gotten to the first Pakod and haven't gotten to the second Yifkod. And Baruch Hashem, many people from this community have had both the Pakod and the Yifkod. So it's all a question of where you are in this continuum of Pakod Yifkod. And what Moshe, as it pertains to Moshe, and as it pertains to what the tradition was, is that consider for a moment that in the Exodus narrative, it's in Parsha Shmos, that Vayitz'aku b'nei Israel. At one point, the Torah says the Jewish people cried out in agony. And it says, Vayizkor Elokim, that God remembered them at that moment. Vayeda Elokim, and God knew. It's because that cry, that scream, was the Jewish people's final realization, we don't belong here. We're not meant to be slaves. We don't belong here. We're not supposed to be here. We're God's chosen people. And that was the first stage of Pakod. And that's exactly what Hashem wanted Moshe to communicate. Pakod Yifkod, or Pakod Pakadati, the first Pakod has arrived. It's time for you to start thinking about redemption. Now, it may not happen for another 6 months to a year from the time that Moshe first comes to them, because we've got a bunch of plagues that we have to go through. There's going to be still backbreaking labor, and it's actually going to get worse before it gets better, because you're going to have to make bricks without straw, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But now's the time of pakod. And eventually, not too long in the not too distant future, there will also be yifkod. Okay, so that's the double language. So you can either use the pakod yifkod explanation of the Alshich, who says that it's the double redemption because it's not just the Jewish people who are being redeemed, but also God's Shechina and his angels who are accompanying the Bnei Yisrael wherever they are in the diaspora. That's the Al-Shich's explanation. Or you can use the explanation of the Imrei Emes and a number of other commentaries who say that the double language of Pakod Yifkod is the redemption of realization, that I don't belong here. And then the Yifkod is the actual physical movement from the diaspora back to Eretz Yisrael and to the period of redemption. Questions, comments? Let's see what we have. Oh, we've got a few chats here. Okay. Will the future Mashiach use this code word? That's a great question. I don't know. I mean, it could be. There may be a medrash that says this. Shloimi says, I believe Eli Wiesel in one of his writings asks whether God was with the people in the camps. It is a difficult concept. Does God oversee the world, or is God in our midst involved with us day to day? Yeah, there's a pithy, cynical joke that's been going around for the last few years, right? So there's a guy in heaven who survived the Holocaust. He was killed in the crematoria, and he goes up to the Ribono Shalom, goes up to God, and he tells God, he says, God, I have a Holocaust joke. Do you want to hear it? God says, sure. So he tells God the joke, and God says, that's not funny. And the fellow says, I guess you had to be there. Okay, so that's the cynical line. That's the cynical joke that, where was God during the Holocaust? But we believe that no matter where Bnei Yisrael finds themselves, even in the concentration camp, Hashem is there with them. Gam ki elech begeit salmoves, lo ira ra ki ata imadi. Even though I'm walking in the valley of the shadow of death, I will not fear, for you are with me. As difficult as that may be, for people who are going through terrible situations, and as difficult as it may be to process intellectually, but it can be emotionally soothing. And our tradition tells us that it's not just made up, it's a reality as well. So I think we'll hold it here for today. You've got the Kol Dodi Do Fake essay on the screen for some of you that are here. And everyone have a wonderful week. We will see you next time.
Mishkayach Reva.
There.